Okay, I think we are ready to go. So good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our very first BCSS Members Only event. I'm just so happy that you could be here today to join us, whether you're joining us from the island, from Prince George, or from Kamloops. Thank you for being here. It is an absolute pleasure to be with you here tonight, and we're very excited about this upcoming presentation. So and obviously for those of you who don't know me, my name is Phaedra Aldridge. I am the CEO of the BC Schizophrenia Society, otherwise known as BCSS. And I would like to acknowledge before we get started that we are grateful to be virtually gathered on Indigenous land, regardless of where you're joining us from. From our offices here in Vancouver, I am grateful to be on the traditional, the ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. We are thrilled that this web event can reach people across the province and not just those in the Lower Mainland. BCSS reaches the entire province, and our team of regional managers, our regional educators, our staff for our Strengthening Families Together, our staff for our kids and teens in control programs, and all the communities, big and small, in all of the BC health authorities. Our team provides education and support to all families affected by schizophrenia and other serious mental illnesses. And by becoming a BCSS member, you are helping to make all of our voices louder. So thank you for being a member of BCSS. Now, schizophrenia, as you probably know, is a very serious mental illness that still has a tremendous amount of stigma. 1 out of 100 people have schizophrenia. So we're not talking a rare disease. And 3 out of 100 people experience psychosis. Now, one of the goals this past year was to increase awareness about serious mental illness, its health, its economic, as well as the many social implications of this illness. And due to the pandemic, there was a lot of public education around depression and anxiety, which is obviously very important, but we cannot forget about serious mental illnesses such as schizophrenia. What it is, the myths, and the many effects it has on the person living with the illness, as well as those family members supporting the person living with it. Not to mention the financial implications on our very limited healthcare dollars. BCSS in the past year has done a lot to increase awareness of serious mental illness through lots of different ways. More staff in rural and underserved areas within our province, more staff to support our younger generation through our kids and teens in control programs, the creation of a number of videos, including a very real and raw emotional video looking at schizophrenia through the eyes of people with the illness and through family members, as well as a video looking at the connection between cannabis and serious mental illness. The creation of a podcast that has turned out to be very successful. It's called Look Again, Mental Illness Reexamined. And we launched our 2nd season yesterday. And the guest is with a woman named Michelle Hammer, and she is fantastic. So I hope everyone can tune into that podcast. She is a woman living with schizophrenia, and she has lots of energy, and she was just a joy to speak with. We also have the creation of our virtual family support groups, our revised programs like Strengthening Families Together. And this revised program is being vetted by a number of people, including our members of our medical advisory board, which we are very grateful for. We also formally changed the organization's mission and vision to acknowledge the important roles that families play. BCSS mission is now to support families affected by schizophrenia and other serious mental illnesses in British Columbia through education, advocacy, and research. We have also worked hard to strengthen our partnerships within the community, ministries, health authorities, and other community partners. In order to be there, to be change, and to have change, we must work together. We have come a long way, but we still have a long way to go with educating people, supporting those dealing with the illness, and helping to create change within our province. And as I said earlier, we cannot do this alone. We need everyone. We need all hands on deck to make this happen. Together, we can continue working towards building a province where those affected by schizophrenia and other serious mental illnesses receive effective treatment and support. A province where family members are recognized an essential partner within the mental health system. And tonight, we get to hear from Dr. Mahesh Menon, who many of you know. And if you don't know, he's an absolute delight. He will be giving us a presentation on the cognitive losses associated with schizophrenia and other serious mental illness, as well as the treatments and therapies that are available once a person has been able to successfully manage their symptoms of schizophrenia with medication. And after, we have left a lot of time for question and answer periods. So we really do want to hear from you. And we ask that you submit your question in the Q&A box. We're obviously going to try and get to as many questions as we possibly can. But yeah, if we can't, our apologies, but we really did want to leave a lot of time so you could ask your questions of Dr. Menon. Okay, so here is Dr. Menon. If you don't know who he is, get ready for this. So Dr. Menon completed his PhD in psychology at the University of Cambridge. He did a postdoc fellowship at the University of Toronto and worked at the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. He is currently a psychologist with Vancouver Coastal Health and is based at the BC Psychosis Program at UBC Hospital. He is also a clinical associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Menon is a co-PI in the Cognitive Neuroscience of Schizophrenia Lab, along with Professor Todd Woodward. I told you it's a long list and it's not done yet. He is one of the founding members of the North American CBT for Psychosis Network and the BC Cognitive Remediation Working Group. Dr. Menon was a recipient of the 2021 Innovation and Translational Research Award with the Vancouver Coastal Health Research Institute. And just earlier this month at our AGM, he was awarded the BCSS Champion Award for his outstanding work in cognition and schizophrenia, which has led to the launch of cognitive remediation pilot programs across our entire province. So without further ado, welcome, Dr. Menon.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Phaedra. So I'm going to talk a little bit about cognitive remediation today, and hopefully we'll have a lot of time for questions, and the questions needn't just be on CR, they can be about other aspects of psychosocial interventions if that people may have questions about as well. So I'm gonna share my screen. Okay. So hopefully people are able to see the slide set. So what I wanted to do today is talk just very briefly about what are the different domains of cognition and what we may think of. Is cognition impacted in schizophrenia spectrum disorders? What is the impact of those cognitive difficulties on daily life functioning? And just talk a little bit about what is cognitive remediation itself. So when we think about these domains of cognition, these are just a range of the thinking skills. So we think about attention as being one of the very basic ones, and even attention can be broken up into different subtypes of attention. So the ability to pay attention for a short period of time might be what we call simple attention. Holding that over a longer period of time, like if I was reading a book, that would be sustained attention. And then being able to split my attention between two different tasks would be what we would call divided attention. So an example of that might be, for instance, when you are driving a car, there are different instances of divided attention that could happen there. For example, if I was shifting my attention between looking ahead, looking in the rearview mirrors, looking in the side mirrors, being aware of my environment by switching between those different components. That is one example of divided attention. The domain that most of us are familiar with is memory. And again, memory can be passed out in different ways. One split is between what's called verbal memory, so our memory for verbal information, and visual or non-verbal memory. And the non-verbal memory can encompass, typically, even though we think about it as the visual spatial components, it can include other things as well. We also can think about memory along two other domains. So if we can think about it as different axes of memory. The semantic memory is our memory for facts and information. And episodic memory is our memory of events. So if I asked you what the capital of France was, and you said Paris, that would be semantic memory. But if you were thinking about, maybe you've made a trip to Paris and you were thinking about the experiences that you had there, that would be episodic memory. Then we get to what's called executive functioning. And it's called executive functioning because we can think of it a little bit like the executive or the CEO of a company that makes the big decisions about how we operate. So the components that make up executive functioning include one aspect, which is sometimes lumped in with memory and sometimes lumped in with executive functioning, which is working memory, which is my ability to hold information in mind and use that information. So for example, if I was holding a phone number that I had looked at in a book, my phone book, and then I was using it to punch that in, that would be me using my working memory there. But we can also think about working memory as the components that I might need to kind of juggle around. So for instance, if I was looking at a recipe book and I knew I had 3 ingredients that I needed to pull out. So eggs, flour, milk. And I turned to the fridge or the pantry. I might not pull them out in that same order. So I might have to adapt and pick out the ones which are most conveniently available and then move those. So juggling that, sequencing that in my memory, that would be an example of using that working memory piece there. The other components of what we would consider executive functioning are the ability to inhibit, and that means kind of like being able to stop something that I have to do and alternatively kind of pick what I might need to do instead. So the ability to, if I have a thought in my head and it's very pressing, the ability to pump the brakes and not interrupt someone, that would be an example of good inhibitory functioning. And the reverse of that would be getting going with things. So the initiation component. So they're two sides of a coin. And lastly, abstract reasoning, planning, sequencing, all of those would be parts of the executive functioning domain itself. Finally, one of the domains that we measure is what's called processing speed. And that there is essentially the motor speed. So for instance, how quickly I might be able to kind of do a simple task, whether that's like pressing a key or a more complex motor task. But then there's also the speed at which I'm processing information in my mind. So how quickly I might be able to take in information that's coming in and use that information. Another aspect of cognition that, depending on how we conceptualize it, is considered a part of basic cognition or a separate aspect is what we call social cognition. And social cognition is all the components that are involved in everyday social interactions. So these might be things like recognizing other people's emotions, recognizing our own emotion states, recognizing facial expressions, or being able to identify other people's intention from what they're saying or how they're saying it, cues of voice, as well as figuring out what is appropriate social behavior in different contexts. So you can imagine that social cognition actually builds on a lot of these domains of, in quotes, basic cognition itself, such as executive functioning and so on. So impairments in these domains can cause impairments in social functioning, and specific aspects of social cognition can also be impaired. So for example, emotion recognition, and those can also have an impact on social cognition, on social functioning. So when we think about schizophrenia and schizophrenia spectrum disorders, we are typically thinking about the cardinal positive symptoms. So hallucinations are perceptual experiences, like hearing voices or seeing shapes that other people don't see, or sometimes hallucinations in our other sensory modalities, like tactile hallucinations, where we might feel something touching us, or smells or tastes. The other key symptom which is used in diagnosis is delusions, which are unusual beliefs, particularly things like paranoia and ideas of reference. And sometimes what is called thought form disorder, where the person might lose their train of thought, and it's difficult to follow their train of thought because their mind's kind of leaping from topic to topic without clear connections between those. So those are what are typically used for the diagnosis of schizophrenia, because those are quite specific to psychosis. However, there are also the negative symptoms, which are characterized by reductions in motivation, in flattening of our emotional expression, reduced speech, or stereotypical speech where the person might say the same few things. And so the positive symptoms aren't positive in the sense that they're good or enjoyable, but rather it is something that we might not see other people experiencing, that someone with psychosis is experiencing. And negative symptoms are a reduction in some of the aspects, for instance, of drive or speech or emotional expression relative to someone that isn't experiencing those difficulties. Now, those negative symptoms are very commonly seen in schizophrenia spectrum disorders, but they also similar to some aspects of, for instance, depression. The other very, very common symptom, if you will, that occurs in schizophrenia spectrum disorders are what we call the cognitive symptoms, which are difficulties in those different domains of cognition, like attention, memory, and executive functioning, and so on. Now, I've put the little asterisks there because they are not used in the diagnosis of schizophrenia. And in the 90s and the early 2000s, there was a lot of debate around this, but it turned out that they are just not specific enough to be helpful in making the diagnosis. However, we can think about this as a very common associated feature in the illness itself. And the combination of the positive symptoms, the negative symptoms, cognitive symptoms are causing the decline in everyday functioning. So when we've looked at the prevalence of the cognitive symptoms, there's been a lot of research which has been done on cognition in schizophrenia. And so this is a paper from, well, I guess close on 30 years ago now, which was looking at the cognitive functioning in a group of young people who had developed a first episode of psychosis and hadn't taken any medication. So we can say that these are not just the effects of medication. And so that line on top at the 0, that's the normative level, that's the average score for the population, if you will. So people who are not experiencing psychosis. And that is the functioning on a range of those different cognitive tests. The unfilled circles are the sample of young people who are having the first episode of psychosis who haven't been medicated. And the filled circles are a group of people a little bit later in their illness who've been taking medications. And what we see is that the pattern of difficulties, of cognitive deficits is very similar. And the domains which are the most impacted are attention, verbal memory, some aspects of processing of executive functioning and processing speed there, so abstraction and flexibility. But the data is suggesting that as a group, most people who have experienced psychosis may experience some level of impact of cognition. And we can see this in people who have schizophrenia, as well as people who've had bipolar disorder with psychosis or depression with psychosis, when compared to people who've never had the experience of psychosis. So we think that psychosis may be associated with some impairment in cognition. Again, this is not specific, so it's not to say that every person experiences it or that the magnitude of those difficulties will be the same for everyone. But as a group, people who are experiencing schizophrenia are likely to show some impact on a multitude of the domains of cognition itself. So how does this impact daily life functioning? When we look at the body of research as a whole, and these are findings from, again, from large studies, and there have been now a number of what are called meta-analyses, where you combine studies, the results from multiple studies together and look at what we see, and the meta-analyses are replicating these findings. So the takeaways are that those difficulties in cognition are a reliable finding in schizophrenia spectrum disorders. And the magnitude of the cognitive deficits doesn't correlate with the severity of the positive symptoms or the negative symptoms for that matter. But the magnitude of the cognitive deficits is a fairly reliable predictor of daily life functioning in domains including employment, independent living, as well as quality of life. And these difficulties do kind of fit with what we would consider like the 5 Ps. They are pervasive, so seen in most people. They are persistent over the course of the illness. They present quite early. And as you can see from that first slide from the Safin et al. Study, there is a progression, and then they plateau out. They don't. It doesn't keep getting worse for the illness, and they predict functional disability. Now, when Kreplin first was looking at schizophrenia, it was referred to as dementia praecox, this idea that it was dementia from a very young age. And of course, we've now reconceptualized it, but he was really getting at some of these characteristics that it was having an impact on cognition itself. Now, even though the cognitive symptoms don't always improve with medication. So medications are great for reducing the severity of hallucinations, to reduce the intensity of the paranoia. Some of the medications can help with the negative symptoms as well. They may not improve cognition. However, we know that when someone is struggling with, let's say, fairly persistent voices or the thought difficulties or fairly pervasive negative symptoms, that can also sort of have an add-on effect on cognition. So if we think that there is an impact on memory functioning, for example, it may also be much harder to remember things or pay attention when we are being distracted by voices, or it's really hard to focus, or we're having those motivational difficulties. So those can make performance of the cognitive tests even worse, but those will hopefully improve with medication. So our advice to everyone is, if you are taking medications for it, do take those, because you will see some improvement in cognition as those other symptoms improve. And we can hopefully work on aspects of cognition ourselves to help, even if those aren't completely ameliorating with the medications that you might be taking. These were some fancy stats and modeling that was done by Professor Chris Bowie, that some of you might know. And I don't really want to get into the details of it, but what I want you to just, the takeaway from this picture is essentially that they looked at the relative impact of positive symptoms, negative symptoms, depression, and domains of cognition on different aspects of social functioning. And they basically did some modeling to look at what is impacting what. So what you can see is from those arrows that, yes, negative symptoms do have what's called, in this case, like, think of it like a negative correlation on interpersonal behavior. So the more negative symptoms you have, the worse you might be doing socially, as does depression. So negative symptoms have a pretty large effect, but so does attention, processing speed, and executive functioning. So the better your executive functioning or the better your processing speed, the more we see a knock-on effect on interpersonal behavior, as well as your ability to engage in different activities in the community, and also on your ability to work. And so what we're seeing with this fancy modeling is that, yep, the positive and negative symptoms do have some impact on work, but many aspects of cognition have a big impact on work, both directly as well as indirectly, by impacting social cognition and social competence. What do we think is going on in the brain? So it's not that there's any aspect of the brain which is like, there's no part of the brain which is, in quotes, not working or anything like that. So this was a study that was done in our lab by my colleague Todd Woodward many years ago. And this is an example of a working memory test. So essentially, the person is shown a list of letters, and then there's a delay, and then they're shown a letter, and they have to say, was this one of the letters that you saw before, yes or no? And so you might see 2 letters before, or 4 or 6 or 8 letters. And so obviously that's a task that's getting harder and harder following a delay. And this was done in the MRI scanner using a functional MRI, so we can look at brain activity or a proxy of brain activity by blood flow. And what we find is that in one brain network itself, so the graph on the left is controls, so people who don't have schizophrenia, and the graph on the right is a sample of people with schizophrenia. What we see on the graph on the left is that there's this kind of increase in brain activity. So 2 letters, 4 letters, 6 letters, and then when they got to 8, that was sort of at the extent of their ability, of their working memory capacity. You can see like there's a lot more effort that's involved there. There's a lot more brain activity in getting to that level. And what we see in our patient group is, 2 and 4 is a similar graph. But when we get to 6 letters, we're basically, they're peaking out. And so there's almost like there's no more room to go above. And what we see in terms of performance is that their performance got better till 6 letters, but then they were really struggling at the 8. So our take-home message from that is that it's not that any part of the brain is not working, but that sometimes there might be inefficiency in that brain activity, which could then be impacting performance itself. So really, the patients need to generate high levels of activation to produce performance equivalent to the controls. But when that activation limit is reached, then they're not able to push themselves beyond that. So we think that this suggests inefficient processing. And hopefully, if we are able to then help with that, we can improve performance. So this is sort of where cognitive remediation comes in. And it's an intervention targeting different aspects of cognition using principles of learning to improve functional outcomes. And it was developed quite a long time ago to help people who had traumatic brain injuries, lesions. There was some idea about whether it could be used to help with preventing the cognitive decline associated with dementias. And there have been a range of different cognitive remediation applications for schizophrenia and severe mental illness. So there can be pen and paper versus computer-based. There are essentially a lot of either what we consider restorative. So think about it like the oversimplified version of that would be sort of brain gym. There are some aspects which are compensatory. So we are actually using alternative strategies to compensate for areas of difficulty that you would practice multiple times a week over varying lengths of time. And there are two general approaches to cognitive remediation. So some will work on what's called improving signal processing. So really kind of working on very simple things like processing speed or tone detection, or kind of differentiating between simple visual stimuli. The goal being, if that inefficiency is happening at the very, very basic signal processing stage, then it's having a knock-on effect as we get to like impose the higher levels of cognition. So if we can get better at differentiating between those, it can help to improve cognition. The alternative approach is where you work on high-level cognition, like executive functioning, to help to improve cognition and multiple aspects of sort of daily life cognitive functioning. So the components of CR is really that there was, as some of you might have known, there was a lot of hope around interventions like Lumosity. Can we just have a computer test that we do that helps to improve functioning? And unfortunately, the results from that suggested that if you do just the computer test as is, almost by rote, you get better at that task, but it doesn't generalize outward to daily life. So the components of CR, one of them does seem to be having some therapist assistance to help to identify those cognitive problems, link the problems to goals, work on the cognitive exercises themselves. The exercises can get progressively harder so that there's more challenge and complexity. But the key thing that the therapist might work with the client, and we're encouraging the clients to do, is really to start to develop these problem-solving strategies. So you're getting better at monitoring strategies. What am I doing that's helping me do this task well? And how can I adaptively use different strategies for different tasks? And then lastly, help to take this out into the real world. How do I start to use those strategies when I'm engaged in real life tasks and transfer my learning from the session over to those daily tasks, and then set those goals and expectations for change and identify problems and problem solve around those. So ABCR typically uses a group structure, but others may use a one-on-one component as well. And typically, it's like an exercise program of other sorts that you may have some 1 or 2 sessions per week to practice the material, but then you're also practicing at home between sessions to master that and to really take it into daily life. And it addresses all of those domains that we had mentioned earlier. So there are a number of widely available commercialized software. We've tended to use one called SPT Pro. There's another one called CogPack, and one called Posit Science, and they've all been used and they've all been shown to be fairly effective. And as I mentioned, the idea is doing the individualized training, looking at what are the domains of cognition which are impacted, and then finding ways to take those to daily life. I just want to show you a couple of examples of these. So, this is the very simple version of an attention task where you have a grid and there's one shape which is different from the other ones, and you are starting to pay attention and then identify which was the odd man out. As you move up to higher levels, those differentiations start to get more and more challenging. So it's really getting you to pay attention and focus your attention for periods of time. This would be an example of a verbal memory task where it's a list learning task where people have to look at a list and use different strategies to remember those lists. And these are examples kind of further along. So you might start off with 3-word lists, 4-word lists, and then get up from there. And then you are shown a list of words, and you have to identify the ones that you saw before or the ones that were new. This is an example of a planning and reasoning task. This is an adaptation of a classic task that's called the Towers of Hanoi or the Towers of London. And essentially, you start off with the configuration that's shown at the bottom, and you're trying to match it to the figure on the top right there. And the rule is you can only move one ring at a time, and you can't put a bigger ring over a smaller ring. So for example, I couldn't put the blue ring over the purple ring on the right-hand side peg. So you have to try to move them one at a time and rearrange the rings to get to that final one in as few moves as possible. So you have to plan it in your head so that there aren't too many extra moves, and basically make it a series of problem-solving tasks that you would work on. And the more you can see and solve those problems, the more you can use those strategies. Hopefully, you may also start to apply some of those to daily life. And we're explicitly finding ways to get people to do that as well. So in October last year, we'd had Dr. Bui over from Queen's University, where he's based. And he has developed an approach that is called action-based cognitive remediation. And it's combines the cognitive training using those SBT Pro tasks with transfer tasks, simulating work environments or daily life challenges. So, for example, you might have a shop environment where participants have to flip between filing and sorting objects, and separating out receipts and to be paid invoices from each other. And the goal is that, so this one is in this simulation, essentially you're told like 2 of your coworkers are off sick today, and could you help step in at their stations? And so you're actually trying to figure out like, okay, how would I switch between these 3 sets of tasks, doing one and then being able to inhibit that, switch over to the next one, and then keep working on those components flexibly, and trying to see if there are strategies that we could use from our from a task like the Towers of London, which could then be applicable in this daily life task. And then in the group, we would also have, so the computer task, a lot of discussion around strategies that they're doing, going back to doing the computer tasks, doing the transfer task, discussions around strategies, and then linking those strategies to the person's own life goals itself. This is, again, the results from a meta-analysis from a few years back. The takeaway message is to say that CR works in schizophrenia. It has been shown to be effective in improving the domains of cognition themselves, but also, really importantly, it can also have a positive effect on overall functioning and potentially on quality of life. So as we're thinking about an integrative treatment model for psychosis, we want to recognize that we can get impact at different levels there. So the medication has an effect on neurotransmitters and neuroreceptors themselves. And of course, we know that those basic neural functioning impacts brain networks, and those brain networks in turn manifest in the aspects of basic cognition, which we can target with interventions like CRT, as well as in the kinds of thinking patterns which are associated with paranoia and delusions, and those would be the domains that are targeted by CBT, so cognitive behavior therapy, or interventions like MCT, which are quite related to each other. And these can happen all in conjunction with each other. And to me, like, a truly integrative treatment would allow for those, with ultimately the goal of improving not just the positive symptoms, but also really getting at improving functioning, so social functioning, quality of life, and allowing people to feel like they are able to live the life that they want to, and be really integrated back in their communities and family and friend groups. So that's it. I wanted to leave time for questions. So huge thanks to the BC Schizophrenia Society, who've been so supportive to us. Some of this work that we have been doing to try to bring cognitive remediation to BC has been done in conjunction with a number of people we've just come together to try to create a working group. Susan Inman, who's such a huge supporter both for BCSS, has been a part of that group, and a number of others, including Tom Eamon, Amy Burns, Dr. Randall White, and Psychosocial Rehab Canada. And then, of course, thanks to my lab, who've been really helpful with our studies around this, and also Professor Bowie for his support in rolling out these interventions. So I'll pause here and we'll see if we can jump back into hopefully some questions and discussion.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. Menon. I really appreciated all the slides as well as your very clear explanation. So thank you very much for doing that. That's great. And for our audience today, if you have any questions for Dr. Menon, please insert them in the Q&A box and we will get to as many as we possibly can. Like I said earlier, I don't know if we're going to be able to get to every single one, but we will certainly do our best to get to as many as possible. So the team is quickly gathering them. So let's get started. So Dr. Menon, first question here. So at what age or at how many years post first episode do cognitive deficits plateau?
We don't know. So, there's some suggestion that actually we may see that in that prodromal period when some of the early symptoms are developing. So in the period just before the first episode of psychosis itself, oftentimes at that point, family members will report that they noticed that there was a change in mood and there was a change in, there was an increase in anxiety and more social isolation, but they may also report some cognitive changes like, my son was having difficulties with attention, schoolwork started to suffer. And it could be that those changes are not just the depression and the anxiety, but also some cognitive changes that are happening before, which then are present at the time of the first episode, but typically within a few years after, we start to see it stabilize. But I don't think we have a clear sense of quite how long it might be before that stabilization happens. But because typically we've just looked at these large samples, so a first episode, and then also, looking at people 5-10 years in. So I don't have a good answer for that. And my hunch is like within the first few years, hopefully things will start to stabilize. We do actually, I should point out there are a couple of caveats around that. One of them is that there is a hypothesis that actually the duration, something about psychosis itself might be neurotoxic. Now, that sounds very scary, but I think what that means is that there is the possibility that people who are having longer durations of untreated psychosis do tend to, as a group, have slightly worse cognitive profiles as well. And this is another reason why we say there is something to be said for, being on medications to try to stabilize those symptoms of psychosis. Similarly, for people who have bipolar disorder and are having psychosis as a symptom of bipolar disorder, the number of episodes that a person is having can have an effect on cognition. So it seems, again, we don't know if that is a marker of severity or if there's something about having multiple episodes which can have a negative impact on cognition. So that's a part of why we really advocate for trying to optimize the medications which can help to stabilize some of those other symptoms as well.
Okay.
The second confound is substance use. We know that chronic cannabis use can have an impact, particularly on attention, memory, processing speed. We know that other more dopaminergic drugs, so things like methamphetamine, amphetamines, crack, can have an effect on, all the domains of cognition and can really be neurotoxic as well.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. Next question. Our son's psychiatrist says studies affirming cognitive remediation uses subjects who are cherry-picked and therefore aren't valid. Can you please address that point? Quite controversial,
So,
but let's hear it, Dr. Menon.
so all studies, when they first start off, right, there's this whole kind of like lab to clinic translation that happens. So typically how research works is I have an idea and I'm going to try to do a small pilot study. And then I'm going to try to do a larger study. So the pilot study might be, 15, 20, 30 people. Then I might try and do a larger study, maybe with 100 people. And then other people will hopefully take this and run with it as well. And then at some point, we think that, okay, this is an intervention which we would like to bring into routine clinical practice itself. And I think that that's where we would start to see the heterogeneity of outcomes. And so when we look at, for instance, meta-analyses, we're taking thousands of participants in dozens of studies and combining the effects together. So again, we could say like each of those could be cherry-picked, but at some point we're recognizing that these are relatively representative samples. Now, having done studies in our lab, I can tell you that, that I think that they're a pretty representative sample. And so the people that we have tended to exclude, for the most part, like I want to have studies which are truly representative of the people that we work with. And the people that we tend to exclude are often just people who don't really want to do it. They're like, look, I don't want to do it. I'm here because I like getting paid to do the assessments, but I'm not being paid to do the group. I don't want to do that. Or people who are actually maybe struggling so much with their symptoms or with substance use that they're not actually able to engage in the intervention. So a lot of the psychosocial interventions, I should say, yes, they may not be for everyone. There might be people who it's really difficult to engage in those, and there might be people who are struggling so much that they can't really engage in it. But my hunch is that it may be less effective than in a research study, but it is still going to be effective.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, next question. So if schizophrenia is associated with low motivation, how do people manage to complete these cognitive tasks? Good question.
Yeah, I think a part of it is really trying to find ways to keep people engaged in the activity. So the most successful CR programs are ones where we are working with people who have some kind of goal. Those could be modest goals like, I'd like to be able to live a little bit more independently. I'd like to be able to, do my own shopping or money management, or it could be social goals like I'd like to be able to start to volunteer or spend more time with people, and trying to see what are the barriers towards that. Or it could be connected to programs like supported employment. So it just depends on where the person's at. So hopefully, if we keep reiterating the connection between what they're doing and these goals, then it's not just that I'm sitting here, pressing buttons on a computer in sort of an abstract way, but rather I'm reflecting on what strategies am I using to get better at this task, and also having discussions of how can I use this to go outside and work on my goal. Having a boyfriend or a girlfriend is a really strong motivator. Sometimes having a job can be a really strong motivator. And we're recognizing the deficits that people have. The second component is that, the games that come along, hopefully some of them are actually more interesting. So there is some of the data that we now have around, like the gamification of different tasks. That's such a buzzword. So young people who like playing computer games, who like the challenge of kind of bumping up to the next level as well, can get into it. Some of them are boring, like the list learning ones do tend to be a bit boring. Some of the ones like the puzzles there are a little bit more interesting. And then the third piece is like having it in a social context can also help people, because social exposure can help to reduce some of that amotivation a little bit.
Okay, thank you for that. So my loved one is challenged by cognitive deficits. And given that there aren't any available CR programs out there, but I guess there are now, which you're working on, Dr. Menon, Would supported volunteering work be preferred over computer games? So I guess they're talking about the games connected to the CR program would be my assumption
Yeah.
based on that.
I don't think it's an either or. If there isn't a CR that's available in the community, absolutely, I think doing anything that we can to get people engaged is helpful. There are other interventions, like for example, we know that exercise is really helpful for both improving depression, reducing anxiety, but also there's data suggesting that exercise can help with increasing dendritic density. So we might be improving cognition by getting people to engage in activity. So really physical activity, social activity, getting people out to meeting with other people, all of those are really good for the brain as well, both in later life development as well as in psychosis. So if they have the option to do both, that's fantastic. If they have the option to do just one out of two, if they were to sit at home and play computer games versus go out and volunteer, absolutely go out and volunteer.
Okay. And are the CR training programs available for the general public, clients, or only with someone's therapist?
So, like I said, I think they are available. There are versions of it which are available for people to get. And one of the limitations that we recognize is that, thinking about how can we do that, but also bring in the other components of CR, like strategy recognition, strategy utilization during the task, and then generalization of those strategies to daily life. I think those three components also need to be added in along with the game. And I realize that is actually a big ask for a family member. And that's a part of why we say, if there was a therapist, that would be great. So we're hopeful that some of these groups can be done remotely, with Zoom as well, so that they can have the group interaction and so on, but then be able to do it at home. And that might be one way to have greater access to people in different parts of BC. But yes, you do have the option to get a membership with those games for yourself as well.
When you mean membership with the games, maybe just explain that a little bit more.
Oh yeah, sorry, yeah. So there are the companies that have these CRT packages. I'm sorry, games is probably not the right term to use.
I just wanted to ask.
Yeah, for sure. So for example, the company that we use for in our study, it's called Happy Neuron, and so they have one version of it, which is there's so many buzzwords in that, but it's called like Scientific Brain Training Pro. But there is a version of Happy Neuron which is just available for consumers, that they can get an account, and then you have the option to play a number of those games, and then you level up as you kind of work through those as well. Similarly, there's a company which is based out of California, which is called Posit Science, and they have two versions of the tasks. So one which anyone can download, and then there's a version which is available if you are doing CR through a therapist. So with SBT Pro, I have a therapist account that I can use to create accounts for the clients who are in my group. But there are other people who just go to Happy Neuron and sign up and get like a membership for that as well.
Okay. And what is the cost associated with these, Dr. Menon?
I honestly don't know.
Okay.
I probably should have checked that, but it shouldn't be too much. The account that we use is between like $100 and $200 a month, but that allows me to set up multiple accounts for multiple people. So that's kind of the high-end. But my hope is it would be like $20 a month or something. But I'm completely making that up.
Okay, no, yeah, and maybe we could look into that and post that on our website just so people have that information. So thank you. Okay, so next question. So there's an underlying assumption that the person with schizophrenia has the desire to fit into the norm of our society. This does not seem to be the case for many patients, though. Can you please talk about this?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So I want to actually differentiate between the goals that we have for our loved ones versus the goals that our loved ones might have. And I think that any meaningful clinical intervention, be it psychotherapy or CRT, is we are trying to identify what is it that they want, what is it that the person wants, and how might we help with that. So it might not be having, a white collar job or a white picket fence, but I think for many of us, there are some universals. We want to feel safe. We want to feel a part of a community, maybe, of people that we care for or we connect with. Most of us, but not all of us, may want to have a relationship as well. And some people might want to have a sense of like achievement that comes from doing something. So whether that sense of achievement could be from volunteering or being able to kind of live independently in their own space and manage that space and manage their life, or whether it would be getting a job, that would vary. So my goal isn't ever to try to get someone to do what I think or to follow my path. That was mine, right? But hopefully we can find something that is meaningful to them. And I think in contrast, the converse of that question, if there are people who we are unable to identify a goal for, that does make it quite difficult to engage in CR, because there isn't a buy-in, there isn't a reason why you would be doing those things. So if someone says, I'm just happy staying at home and playing video games, and we don't think that that is a protective mechanism, we think that that's kind of where they're at, and that can be difficult sometimes.
Yeah. And I like how you said that, finding meaningful tasks or meaningful activities, whatever those activities may be for that particular person or that particular family. So I liked how you said that. And obviously there's different ideas about what success is. So well said, Dr. Menon there. Okay, next question. Good question. How does the cognitive deficits caused by schizophrenia vary from that of autism? And obviously we've been talking a lot about autism lately, so I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so there are, of course, some similarities with if we just looked at the profiles of some of the neuropsych tests, we might see some similarities, but also some fairly profound differences. So again, we know that a proportion of people who have autism or autism spectrum disorders may also have cognitive impairments, but we can have a substantial subgroup who may have normal or above normal cognitive profiles as well. So we find that with autism, some of the difficulties are around specific aspects of executive functioning, so kind of some of the flexibility components, and with social cognition itself, so emotion recognition, recognizing people's intention from like tone or cues, or understanding those social cues and so on. But they may show excellent kind of abstract problem solving skills in some domains. So, and they may not show any of the memory problems. So there are lots of people with autism who have normal or above normal levels of memory and attention and some aspects of executive functioning. But with schizophrenia, we see these difficulties with simple attention, verbal memory, processing speed, and some of the executive functioning components, which may not be seen with autism.
Okay, thank you for that. And have you done any studies with people who have late onset schizophrenia? So that's the question, but I think we should back that up a little bit and talk about what is considered late onset schizophrenia, and then followed by the second question, have you done studies with people who do have that late onset schizophrenia?
Right, so there are a few different definitions of late onset schizophrenia. So typically, when we look at the curve, the normal curve of the onset of symptoms, what we find is that for men, the peak of that curve is sort of between the ages of about 18 and 24. So most young men, we will start to see have symptoms in that window. Some people in their earlier teens, some people in their late 20s, but that sort of covers the bulk of it. For women, that peak is a little bit later. It's sort of from 22 to about 28, where we would see a lot of those. And some people would have their symptoms start earlier. Some people have symptoms start later. Unfortunately, the early onset of the symptoms is sometimes associated with more severe illness and sometimes more severely impacted cognition. And the contrast, that late onset is often associated with slightly better outcomes because people have had a chance to kind of develop some of the social skills, have had more meaningful connections, and so on. For women, there is a second bump that happens around menopause. So there is a subgroup of people who develop some symptoms of psychosis in their 50s. And we think that may have to do with hormonal changes that are happening around menopause, but we don't fully know why. So late onset could be someone who's developing psychosis in their late 30s, for example, but it could also be referring to that subgroup of people, women specifically, who are developing some psychosis symptoms, in their 60s. And sometimes we also see psychosis as a symptom of dementia, but that's sort of another story unto itself. So having said that, I personally we in our studies haven't really differentiated between really early onset and late onset. We tended to try to have it open to people across the spectrum. And but we do look at when they develop the illness and the duration of the illness, the number of years that they've had it, the number of episodes that they've had it, and so on. And that's why we're saying that we can see some of those associations.
Okay. And once again, just showing the need for more research, right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, next question. So I believe learning in general becomes harder as one gets older for everyone. Yes, I think as we all know that.
Yep.
So are the benefits of CR beneficial for those who have been diagnosed recently versus those who have lived with the illness for some time, for example, for approximately 10 years?
Yeah, so many of our studies involve people who've had the illness for about 10 years. So if you look at the typical schizophrenia study, the typical participant is someone who is between their mid-30s and late 40s and has had their illness for between 10 and 20 years. Lots of studies of cognition, of CR, and so on. That's the population that we get, because that's really kind of where we would see a lot of people living their lives with the illness. The people who've had a really good response early on, they don't need to be in those studies, right? So Chris actually had a study, Chris Bui had a study that came out recently that actually found that it was really helpful for people who had been unwell for 10 or more years and had actually a below average IQ. So they found that they were able to get a bit of a boost from doing those CR goals. So it is definitely helpful for that subgroup when we look at the population as a whole. But we also think that it could be really helpful if we can get people into it early on, because hopefully we can prevent some of that decline that's happening between the first episode and later on in the illness, in that window, if we think about it as being about the first 5 years of the illness. So it's a really long-winded answer, as so many of mine are, that suggests that yes, it is effective for people later on in the illness, but it would be ideal if we can get to people early in the illness. And I feel that way also about therapy in general.
Okay. Now you talked about later on in the illness. What about age itself? So if we were to look at a younger person versus an older one, what differences are you seeing there when it comes to age?
So, we went, again, because our hope is that like people in the, mid 30 to mid 40 zone aren't showing a huge impact in general. Like, we're all kind of slowing down and our memories are less good than they were maybe when we were in our mid-20s. But we are trying to look at that sample of kind of first episode schizophrenia, which is the late teens to late 20s, and then also typically the people who are, if we can use the word chronic schizophrenia, but they've been unwell for quite a while. So so we think that it's going to be really helpful here, but it has been shown to be effective for people, who are aging, who have had the illness for 10, 15 years as well.
Okay, thank you. And this is a good question. I mean, I know that the province is looking at those 12 pilot sites across British Columbia, which is fantastic. But the questions here is connected to the logistics about getting into the program. So question number one, where can we find it? How does it work? Does a psychiatrist get in touch with the patient, with the individual that has a lived experience, or the family? How do we approach? Do we approach the EPI team or the mental health team to include CR? So maybe just talk, Dr. Menon, about the logistics for people accessing CR within BC.
Yeah, so we had done a round of training last year, and we're hoping to do another round of training. So there are some of these sites which are starting to run these groups. I think the best thing that you could do for yourself, if you were someone living with schizophrenia or as a family member, might be to directly contact the mental health team to find out if CR is being offered there and when the group might be. And lots of times, I think with interventions, they'll do one cycle of it and then have a wait list of people who are wanting to jump in and then do the second cycle and so on based on that. So talk to your psychiatrist, but also talk to your case managers. We've had a lot of the people who did the training with us were OTs and some nurses, and people who work in the mental health team. So I think reaching back out to the mental health team, if you are being followed by the mental health team, would be probably the best thing to do. And if you're not, then kind of asking your psychiatrist if there's a way to refer to whichever might be the local mental health team that's doing it may be a helpful way forward.
And what is your website again, Dr. Menon, or where can people get information if they wanted to contact the mental health team?
So the mental health teams are the teams in each geographical area or catchment there. So through Interior Health, there would be all of those teams. In Vancouver, there are the teams with Kitts, West End, Strathcona, and so on. So yeah, so that would be the teams that are following the person with.
Okay. So it's not, I was just thinking that maybe it was too simple, just one place where people could go to get that information for Kamloops or for Kelowna or for the island for Interior.
Well, so the at present, the sites which are piloting CR, we have compiled a list together, and Jean had made a list which is on your website, on the BCSS page.
Okay.
And I think she's going to post a link to that, and it may already be in the chat somewhere. So
perfect. Okay, thank you for that. Okay.
And then we have some information about it as well. We on our website, which is like cognitive-remediation-bc.ca. But we don't have the list of the sites that are doing it. There is just kind of, again, a description of CR. Okay,
perfect. And I know that the team just put a note in the chat line as well for more information on that. So thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so next question. Glycin, this is a very specific question, shows improvement in brain neuroplasticity. Will that come into play, I guess, in terms of CR? And this person, the question was, my son's cognitive abilities is terrible, plus he smokes pot. So obviously that also plays a role.
I have not been following the research literature around supplements for cognition. I know that people have looked at it, and there's been some studies looking at lysine, omega-3s, vitamin E, and so on. And I think that they could have a positive effect. As could, I think, like a lot of just simple lifestyle things can also have a positive effect on cognition. So regular sleep cycles, exercise is huge. And, like the data on healthy aging has actually suggested that exercise and social interactions and meaningful activity are all really positive in protecting cognitive functioning and actually improving cognition as well as or preventing any decline as we age.
Okay, thank you. Another good question. Great questions, everybody. So why is there such a lack of knowledge within the medical, another controversial question here for you, Dr. Menon. Why is there such a lack of knowledge in the medical profession regarding cognitive deficits around schizophrenia?
Well,
$1 million question, right?
Yeah. Even though the findings around cognitive deficits in schizophrenia are very well established, oftentimes people tend to think of that as being almost an epiphenomenon of the illness. It's to say that, oh, it's happening because you're also having the delusions and hallucinations or the negative symptoms. And I think for people who've been unwell for a while, clinicians can sometimes, reduce their expectations of kind of where this person should be relative to their peers, which I think is really unfortunate. And I think it's kind of a clinical nihilism that we need to fight against. It's not a helpful approach. So I think that we sometimes underestimate the true cognitive effects of schizophrenia, and also because it's not specific to the illness, it has not been lumped into the formal diagnostic criteria, so people don't think about it as much. And because the focus of treatment often tends to be how do we manage the positive symptoms and the negative symptoms, we don't tend to think as much about the cognitive symptoms itself. So when the DSM-5 was coming out, there was a lot of debate actually within the academic community about whether, and for DSM-4, like the text revision that happened in the mid-90s, as well as some discussion for DSM-5, should we include cognitive symptoms as one of the characteristics that are associated with schizophrenia? Like, would that improve awareness of it? Would it get clinicians to actually check? And so in the pilot studies that we had done for the DSM-5, there was like, one of the questions was, how much has cognition been impacted? Not at all, mildly, moderately, severely, but they didn't end up kind of making that into the final decision-making rubric. But hopefully that whenever DSM-6 comes along, or ICD-11 or 12, those things will get included in there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially with all the work that's being done around CR, that will make a big impact and help the new medical professional people that are coming into the system as well. So, okay, so how can you approach somebody with anosognosia plus obsessive compulsive disorder, and the current obsessive focus is against anything to do with health and intervention? Let me break this down a little bit. So how can you approach someone with anosognosia plus obsessive compulsive disorder, and the current obsessive focus is against anything to do with health and intervention? So, so I think, and feel free to jump in here, Mahesh, as well, but I obviously anosognosia, as we all know, is where somebody does not believe they're ill. So obviously they have anosognosia plus obsessive compulsive disorder, and obviously their focus is against anything to do with intervention and getting treatment, is how I'm interpreting this question.
Yeah. Well, so just to big up the podcast as well, Phaedra and I had a great discussion about anosognosia, which is in the one of the episodes of the podcast, which is coming out, I think, in November. So my hope for, again, in engaging with the person who is struggling with those difficulties is to try to find a common goal. If the common goal is, how do we reduce your distress, or how do we reduce your suffering, what might we be willing to do that might be working towards that? And so if the person is recognizing that they are struggling with those difficulties, or they are feeling anxious, maybe the goal is, how could I feel less anxious about it? And sometimes the way that people introduce medications, and I don't think it's disingenuous, is we don't want to get into the battle around, this is the medication for your psychosis. I think the key point is really helping the person understand what part of their experience could this help with. Like, could you take a medication that could help you sleep better? Could you take a medication that could help to just make that constant sense of pressure and terror just a little bit milder? Could it make that the stickiness of my thoughts just a little bit easier, right? Could this be kind of WD-40 for my brain? That could be a reason to it. If the person is willing to talk to someone, maybe those conversations can lead to the discussion around then what could be the next step. So yeah, I'm sorry that you're struggling with that. That is like a hard combination of things, but I think the best thing that we could think about is just to think like, what is the common goal that we could work towards, and what would help that person just feel listened to and understood there as well. And again, plug for related to anosognosia, some of you may have seen this great book by Javier Amador, which is called I'm Not Sick, I Don't Need Help. And he talks about his approach that was developed that they call the LEAP approach, that he had used with his clients, but also he talked about how it was really helpful with his brother who struggled with schizophrenia as well and had anosognosia, didn't recognize that there was any difficulties there. So that could be something that may give you some more helpful pointers as well.
Yeah, thank you. And Dr. Menon, you're absolutely right. The podcast, we talked a lot about having those common goals, and the podcast is coming out in 2 weeks, and it was a fascinating discussion. And now I'm not looking at you, Dr. Menon, I'm looking at everybody else. It really was a fascinating discussion, and I learned a ton in that conversation. So it's coming out in 2 weeks. And once again, the podcast is called Look Again, Mental Illness Reexamined. And Dr. Menon, you were fantastic in that episode. So I hope everybody tunes in for that. Okay, so next question. What are some low-tech, this is a good question, low-tech daily activities that really help building cognition? And I know you've touched on some. I know you mentioned exercise as being one, but are there any other daily activities that people with lived experience and their families supporting those should be focused on?
Yeah, so I think that activities which allow for, allow us to work on simple attention could be, even things like reading together, where the person is actually following along with something, to see if we can just by reading with someone, you can help them to sustain their attention for long periods of time, which can be really helpful. We can have, tasks like helping with cooking together, if that's possible, because that requires so many of the components of basic cognition really come to fore when cooking. And if we're worried about the person by themselves, maybe helping out. So, dividing your attention. If I'm chopping the tomatoes while frying the onions, I have to keep going back and forth between those two things to make sure I'm not burning one or forgetting the other one, being able to switch my attention between those, make a plan to say, okay, how would we want to do this, and have that discussion around kind of planning and sequencing. Those can help. Sometimes games which have like hand-eye coordination can be really helpful. If we were playing ping pong as a family or something like that, there's kind of the hand-eye coordination, the sustained attention piece, which could be useful there. Playing little memory games or that we could do can be helpful. There is some data actually suggesting that even playing computer games can be quite helpful for people with processing speed and with attention. So, if your loved one does spend a little bit of time playing computer games, as long as it's not a lot, a little bit of it might actually have some positive effects there also.
Okay, thank you. And this question deals with the why. It's a good question. So what has happened in the brain to cause cognitive deficits in the first place with someone with schizophrenia? So I guess the why does it happen?
So the deep, honest answer is I don't know. I can tell you for sure why it is. I can tell you what some of the hypotheses that we have around it are, and there'll be a little bit of hand waving that happens with this. So there is a hypothesis that schizophrenia has a neurodevelopmental component. So we might see some of the difficulties in how the brain is developing itself. So when the brain is developing in utero, the brain cells move over to create the different layers. And so there are these layers of neurons within the brain, kind of from the top of the cortex kind of going down. And so the gray matter is kind of where some of the cell bodies and the dendritic connections are, and then there's the white matter, which is like the tube that's going through, and there are the connections that happen in all of those. So one of the hypotheses is that as the parts of the brain are migrating, some of the connectivity hasn't happened as effectively. A second possibility is that when we are born, there is a lot of connections and a lot of brain cells. And a part of what's happening in adolescence is what's called synaptic pruning. So connections which are deemed to be underutilized, unnecessary, and so on get pruned, a bit like, pruning a hedge. And one hypothesis is that that pruning process goes awry, and that can lead to some of the difficulties that we see in schizophrenia. So the brain networks aren't connected to each other as efficiently, and they're not able to switch as flexibly into the different configurations itself, which then leads to the cognitive deficits that we see. So there's some data suggesting that there might be kind of early childhood signs of cognitive difficulties in some people who go on to develop schizophrenia. So the rates of difficulties like learning disorders and ADHD are actually elevated in people who will go on to develop psychosis. But there might be something that's happening with the synaptic pruning, which is then kind of closer to the time that we are starting to see the deficits that actually arise in psychosis itself. And that's also why there's some data that shows that window of your early teens, when some of this pruning is happening in early adolescence, is actually a very important window. And the kids who are smoking a lot of weed in that time have a much higher rate of developing psychosis, because it could be that at that stage, cannabis can have a particularly damaging effect, unfortunately. So people who tend to come to smoking weed kind of later in life, it has less cognitive effect than people who started smoking weed in that 12, 13, 14, 15 age group.
And through the podcast, I've learned that it's actually the age of 25. Is that correct, where cannabis really has an effect, Dr. Menon? Because the brain is still developing.
The brain is still developing. So there are two things that are happening kind of in adolescence and all the way through to 25. And that is actually this process of synaptic pruning and more effective kind of connections with the neurons and the synapses that are left behind, particularly in the frontal lobe. So our executive functions continue to develop into our mid-20s. So that's also why teenagers do a lot more dumb stuff that we wouldn't do later on in life. 18-year-olds continue to do some of those things, and then once you get into your 20s, you look back with fondness and sometimes regret at some of those shenanigans, and you say, God, I don't know why I did that. But that's really because our executive functioning, our ability to plan, to see the consequences of our actions actually gets better. That is really a big part of what our executive functioning does. Figure out, what do I need to do? Figure out, if I do X, what would be the consequences of it? Stop myself from doing things which might seem like they're very fun to do, and instead push myself to do the more responsible, more boring, less fun things, which maybe what all of adulting is life. So all of that change continues till we're about 25. And so, yeah, that's that window is certainly, like, if can continue till then, but it seems like it's quite harmful early on and generally could continue to have a negative effect all the way through about our mid-20s.
Okay, thank you for that. See, that's another benefit of getting older, right? Okay, so next question. So this question has to do with, obviously, computers and the internet would be solitary and antisocial. So for a person who does have schizophrenia, how do we get them involved and working with their trained practitioners in person and not on the computer? I assume what they're asking here is, so we're maintaining that level of sociability and we're keeping them engaged. So how do we get them off the computer and interacting with a real person, such as their physician or practitioner?
Yeah, I mean, of course, unfortunately, COVID had a huge backward step on that, right? Because we had to do so much of our clinical work and groups and so on by Zoom. My hope is that as things ease up with the pandemic, hopefully going into next year, we will be having more in real life interactions. I think sometimes we encourage participants in those groups to be able to, like, connect with each other. A group like a CR group, I think there's no reason to not do that, but to have some in real life connection. So I think rather than, I hear your question. I think rather than just thinking about it as should they be on the computer or outside, I think the hope is that there may be a bunch of things that they end up doing on the computer, both if the groups are only offered that way, or if they are, doing those activities on the computer as well, but hopefully also find some reason to do things outside. So I think having asking their teams if they could meet with a client in person can be a way to get out there to do that. Advocating with your teams to switch to in-person groups sooner rather than later when the numbers come down enough could be really helpful as well, because I think the teams do need to know that this is something which would be beneficial to them, also just to push them to doing that as well.
Yeah, having those in-person groups as well as that one-on-one connection, so critical.
Yeah.
Okay, so this next question, you have touched on this a little bit earlier, but the question is, do you feel that independent living, such as requiring basic shopping, limited social interaction, can assist in cognitive retention? So I guess that's the first question, so keep that in mind. And the follow-up is, our daughter was diagnosed at the age of 16. She is now 39 and has repeated episodes, if not years, of psychosis. She stopped work 12 years ago and ever since has complained of memory loss. So what information can you provide for somebody at her age? So once again, the age of 39, because she's obviously seemed to have reached a plateau. So a few questions there. So question number one is, what do you feel is the role of independent living can play, such as requiring that basic shopping and limited social interaction, and the role and impact it can have in cognitive retention?
Yeah, so I think the more things we are doing in our daily life, the more we're working our brains to do it, right? I think, we can think about a simple parallel of, with exercise, we think that it's great to do, high intensity exercise and so on, but we're often encouraged, like, don't sit on your chair, just walk around and do things, right? So the small things can have a positive effect. I think work can be really cognitively stimulating, but it can also be really meaningful in a number of other ways. It gives us the sense of purpose. It makes us feel like we're connected to people. So if work was hard, I wonder if there are other options, which could be things like, if there are supported employment opportunities in the community that you're at, whether those may be worth exploring, whether there is some option to do some volunteering, whether there is an option to find some sort of pro-social or meaningful activity, whether it would be like, volunteering with a seniors home where we could, like, sit with someone, maybe play a game with them or take them out, help them out with their shopping. Because all of those, even if they're not paying us the money, can really fulfill that need to feel like I'm doing something useful and I'm helping people out and I'm challenging myself a little bit as well. And it could be my own bias, obviously, given my life choices. I do think that those things can have a real positive effect on our general well-being and quality of life. So if there was a way to find some small baby steps to move in that direction, away from work, but to do things meaningful outside, maybe those could be helpful to do as well.
Okay. And what role, Dr. Menon, do you think families can play in helping to support that person with those daily activities? What can family members do?
I think certainly helping them, sometimes even just, oftentimes with a motivation and the way that can play out, it can be hard to make that first step. But if it's something that your loved one wants to do, even being able to sit with them and help them to take that first step, whether it's like writing out that email or looking online for those volunteer opportunities, or, accompanying them when they were going there, rewarding those choices with both positive interactions, but also, like pairing it with something fun that they might want to do. Those could all be ways that we could help them. But again, being able to have that discussion about what might be something meaningful to them so that they don't feel like you're forcing them to do something that you want to do rather than something that they want to do. So ideally it would be something that they can say, oh yeah, this is something that I've wanted to do that you can help me out with.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the importance of family, as we all know. Okay, here's and just for, so it's 8 o'clock, just so everyone is aware. So we have about 15 minutes left with Dr. Menon. So please, if you haven't already, if you have a burning question, please try and get it in now. We will, as I said, try and get through as many questions as we possibly can. So if you have that that question that you're just really dying to ask, please get it in now and we'll do our best to address it. Okay, Dr. Menon, so can you please talk a little bit about the cognitive benefits / deficits of antipsychotics versus what you've been sharing about the cognitive deficits of the disorder alone? Good question.
Right. So there have been studies which have looked at the effects of antipsychotics and whether it has a net negative effect on cognition or not. And I think that the consensus seems to be that it's not having a negative effect on cognition. There was hope that some of the antipsychotics could help to improve cognition, and they haven't been super successful with that part of it. Like from symptom stability, it hasn't added it on. There was some hope with some of the newer antipsychotics like brexpiprazole, but it doesn't suggest that it is negatively impacting cognition. I know that for some people, when they have been on some medications, especially at higher doses of medications, or when they've started on medication, there's a lot of sedation that happens. And so there is, of course, the impact that sedation can have on attention and so on. But if there is a way to hopefully find that balance where it's a dose which is having an impact on reducing the intensity of the hallucinations or paranoia or some of those the speech, the amotivation, and so on, then hopefully finding ways to manage the sedation can be a separate goal which can happen with your team. But while there are the anticholinergic effects and the sedating effects, we don't think that overall it is negatively impacting cognition. There has actually been some data that suggests that some medications may actually improve that idea that we talk about this dendritic density quite a lot. So essentially you've got one neuron, then you've got another neuron, and they talk to each other by kind of like the connections there, and each neuron may be connected to like a bunch of other neurons through these dendrites. So one idea is that some medications, some substances can kind of reduce dendritic density, and some things increase dendritic density. And sometimes learning and improving cognition is associated with this improved density of connections between the neurons themselves. And there is some data suggesting that actually antipsychotics and some mood stabilizers can actually increase dendritic density itself.
Okay, thank you. A nice segue. Can you recommend ways to help a family member with schizophrenia stick to a treatment plan?
I think, again, like being able to have an honest conversation about the struggles with the side effects that the person might have, but also being able to highlight some of the positives that we're seeing, and hopefully connecting the medications that they're taking to their own goals and values is really going to be the most meaningful way forward.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Do you think that educating patients on their reduced cognition and how CR can help will help with motivating patients to stick with our treatment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for all of us, the better we understand it, the better we might do. We know that getting cognitive or neuropsychological assessments, they are quite hard to get in the community, and there's only a few neuropsychologists attached to the mental health teams. But understanding cognition in general, but also understanding my own cognitive profile, what are my strengths and weaknesses, can be really helpful to say like, okay, these are the things that I could work on what might be ways that I could work on, as well as the fact that when I'm unwell, lots of my actually functional cognition can go out the window, right? It might be a lot harder for me to like pay attention to things, remember things, function in the world, because I might be so distracted and stressed by what's going on. So obviously symptom improvement can improve my functional cognition, and then also knowing my own cognitive profile or understanding those ideas around cognition can be helpful as a motivator to stay in treatment as well.
Okay, thank you. Now, we talked about autism before, and this question is asking, what is the relationship between schizophrenia and colitis and Crohn's? Good question.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I know that there's been kind of a burgeoning body of literature that has looked at the role of the microbiome in a whole lot of conditions, including colitis and Crohn's to psychiatric disorders. But unfortunately, that's a little bit outside of my area. I couldn't tell you much beyond just that sort of like general statement towards him.
Thank you. Another area that we obviously need to continue looking into. Yeah. So my family member received his third discharge plan this year from hospital. My observation is that almost all of the cognitive domains you described are deteriorating. The psychosis, drug resistant, sorry, I don't know what that sentence is. Despite more and more engagement with epi and mental health resources, our loved one is fading and fragmenting at an alarming rate. What are your thoughts on what we can do about this?
First of all, I'm so sorry to hear that. Like, that just sounds so difficult to have to watch. I think the hopeful part there was that you are engaged with the team and that your loved one is engaged with the team as well. I think one of the best predictors of engagement or like in a treatment plan is the person's rapport and relationship with the treatment providers itself. So if you feel listened to and understood and supported by the team, and they feel understood and supported by the team, then hopefully they can continue to do the work there, whether it's going to the groups, whether it's taking the medications, taking part in the social and exercise activities. And again, I think while it is difficult sometimes to watch that, do keep in mind that there are a number of medication choices which are available, and things like options like clozapine are typically done later on in the algorithm itself. So there are options which may still be present. So don't lose hope quite yet.
Yeah, especially after the third discharge. So yeah. Okay, there's a phase 2 research study in Vancouver on a medication that is supposed to improve cognition. First off, I guess, do you know anything about this? And second of all, what do you think about this?
I don't, so I couldn't really comment on it. I know that there are some early trials. I think it's great. It's always good that this, the fact that pharmaceutical companies are trying to pay attention to ways to improve cognition is a good sign as well, because I think obviously psychosocial measures, and if there are biochemical measures that need to kind of go hand in hand, that would be fantastic. But I couldn't tell you more about it because I don't know much about those trials.
No, thank you for that. So what work similar to CR is being done in other places?
Not sure I understand. Like, do you mean is CR being done in other places, or?
Yeah, I think my interpretation of the question would be, so is CR being done in other places?
Yeah, so our hope is, we would like to roll this out in BC. We are both advocating with the teams, with the health authorities, with other stakeholders to say like this would be helpful. We do think that having a larger suite of psychosocial interventions is going to be meaningful. And then beyond BC, CR is being rolled out in in Ontario, because that's where Dr. Bui is based, and they have a whole initiative now in Ontario to offer CBT as well as other psychosocial interventions. So they're doing a lot of training in CR and in other psychotherapies for psychosis, which is really, really positive. And we are involved with other groups of people doing this work. So CR is quite, it's well, I wouldn't say it's everywhere, but it's in quite a few places in the US and in parts of Europe as well. So hopefully it's just sort of growing. And I think the big thing is that people are recognizing that, we don't just treat schizophrenia with medications. There's more things that we need to do, really. And that's sort of the big part of like the shift that's happening in care itself.
And as you said, the focus for so long has been on the positive and the negative symptoms. So we need to start looking at the cognitive deficits and what we can do about it. So, and that's where programs like CR is essential. Yeah. Okay, so this last question, nothing like ending with a very controversial question. You ready for this one, Dr. Menon? This one doesn't have to do with CR specifically. It is addressing the question, and we talk about this a lot, the term schizophrenia. So the question is, why do we not change the name of schizophrenia to a different, less socially problematic name? Hot topic, very controversial. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
I agree. I think that there's probably a number of diagnoses that have so much stigma that it might be time to kind of look at it. And again, there were suggestions around that. I think there's a psychologist named Richard Bentall in the UK who's written about the idea that it's meaningful to just refer to schizophrenia, and maybe we should refer to it as the schizophrenias, because people can have very different presentations and have the same overarching diagnosis. We do tend to think now about a more dimensional approach to it. We think of it as the schizophrenia spectrum disorders, or the schizophrenia spectrum itself, that there's a spectrum from normality to illness, if you will, and that people fall somewhere along there, and we can kind of shift further up and down on that one. But I think at the end of the day, I do believe that the bigger change in addressing stigma is not in the name, but it's in the attitude that we have towards it, right? Because if we change a name, but we have the same attitude, the new name just becomes stigmatized in 10 years down the road. I think the more we really see that, we are all on that continuum, and we could all have these difficulties, and that the differences between us aren't that big, and address some of the big myths and misinformation, all the way from rubbish like multiple personalities through to like they're violent and we should avoid them. It's really kind of addressing that misinformation. I think that's going to be more important. So personally, I want to try to kind of work on those bits, because I think the name change is cosmetic more than really getting at the underlying issue there. But that's my perspective, and I can see that to someone who's like, I hate the label, absolutely. And so when I work with my clients, I don't care about the label. Like, that's not my point. When we work in the health system, the diagnosis is a shorthand for something that we need to kind of address, and that's not what I'm focused on in my discussions with my clients, hardly ever, unless it's to say like, okay, help me understand this label and what it means. To me, that's a shorthand. That's not actually meaningful in my interactions with the person. It's really saying like, okay, how do we get you to have the life that you want? How do we address these difficulties that you're dealing with? The label doesn't really mean anything to you, and it shouldn't really matter.
Yeah. Well said. And I think that's something that you're well aware, Mahesh, that we've really tried to do at BCSS, is to increase the awareness about serious mental illness, and to really get into the stigma and the myths that surround schizophrenia and serious mental illness. And we say that all the time, 1 out of 100 people is not rare. And that's why we need to talk about this. And I see your point about the label, but I also think that to your point, if we were to change the name, then 5 or 10 years or 20 years down the road, there's going to be a stigma associated with that new terminology. So I think we just need to say what it is, and it's schizophrenia, and it's an illness.
Yeah. Or, like if we say like people are experiencing psychosis, right? That can happen in a bunch of different, conditions. And again, we know that there's a diagnostic ambiguity. So it's not even within the health system, if we're saying like schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder with psychosis, depression with psychosis, that is less important than saying, okay, what are the issues that we need to deal with? And I think that I tend to just use the term psychosis, especially in those cases where it's ambiguous, because that is the issue that we're trying to address. But if that term itself is hard, then you can just really thinking about like what is the specific issue that we want to address, whether it's the voices, the paranoia, the disorganization, the amotivation, that at the end of the day, for the person that I'm working with, that's what's most meaningful. So in my work with them, that term, that word doesn't come up as often as you might think, even though that is my bread and butter and what I do day in, day out. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I truly hope, Dr. Menon, that one day, we will be able to talk about schizophrenia the same way that we talk about diabetes or heart disease or MS or any other illness. And that truly is my hope, that, and I assume it's yours as well, that I don't want to put words in your mouth, that we will be able to talk very openly about schizophrenia and the fact that it's an illness, and the fact that we need to find ways to increase awareness and decrease that stigma as much as we possibly can, and to be able to find those champions who are willing to put up their hand and talk about the effects of schizophrenia on their life, on their loved one's life, as we said before, the social, the economic implications of it. And that truly is my hope, that we will get to that point one day.
Yeah, definitely. Me too.
Yeah. So, Dr. Menon, thank you. Unfortunately, it's 8:20, so we've actually gone over, but just thank you so much for answering all of these questions. And I really appreciated your answers. You were thorough, you were very clear, and you were able to take some pretty complex terms and terminology and translate it into something we can all understand. So thank you so much for taking the time and your willingness to speak with us tonight. It's greatly appreciated.
Thank you. It's absolutely just a pleasure and privilege to be here. And thank you guys so much for staying so late.
Thank you. And everyone watching, thank you so much for being a part of tonight's very interactive event. And if you have any questions at all, please email us, and we'll do our best to address all of your questions. And all the links and resources from tonight and mentioned during this event tonight will be on the BCSS website, which of course is www.bcss.org. And tonight's event is being recorded, so if you'd like to watch it again or share it, please feel free. Lots of valuable information for lots of different people. And just as a side note, if you didn't know that next year is the BC Schizophrenia Society's 40th year. Yes, we have been around for 40 years, so which is absolutely incredible, and we have another 40 plus years to go, but we truly do need everybody to be involved, whether it be clinicians such as Dr. Menon, to our boards, to all the regional managers and my frontline team. We need all hands on deck to be able to get to where we just talked about. So thank you for everyone's support, and I really do look forward to the next 40 years. So if you're not a member, obviously you're all members because you had to be involved in this event, but please spread the word and sign up for all of the information so you get the up-to-date information. So that's the BCSS electronic newsletter called Friends of BCSS. Obviously the podcast, which is being mentioned tonight, and once again, it's anywhere where you listen to podcasts, so Apple Music, Spotify, and we'd really like to hear your thoughts on the event tonight. So please just make sure that you take time to go over the survey. We would love to put on more events like this, and we really do want to hear your feedback. And earlier tonight, Dr. Menon, you mentioned that you work very closely with Dr. Todd Woodward, who many of us know. And I just wanted to remind everyone that through the generosity of donors, through the BCSS Foundation, that we've been able to support researchers like Dr. Woodward and yourself. So yes, just thank you to everybody for being a part of this tonight. And I also want to give you a special shout out to the people who put this event together, Jean, Andrew, Cynthia, Neha. It was a lot of work and you've come through again. So thank you. Yeah, and Jean really did take the lead with this. So thank you. And just once again, before you leave, please make sure you fill out that survey. It's just going to pop up as you leave Zoom. And once again, this is a team effort. As I said, we need everybody to increase awareness about serious mental illness, to decrease the stigma that is associated, and to really make a difference when it comes to talking about serious mental illness and truly making an impact within our province. So thank you to everybody tonight for taking part, and we will be in touch. Thank you.